Hi, Dave Sussman back with Ricochet, and we are still at the CPAC 2017 convention here in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted today to be speaking with Chris Garcia. Chris is with the U.S. State Department Entrepreneurship Program, and he is also with the National Diversity Coalition for Trump as an advisor. Chris, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Dave.
I want to jump right into something with you, and this is something that you and I have discussed as well. There's a lot of articles and publications that have interviewed you, and they're coming to you because of your ethnicity as a Mexican American, and you are for Trump. You were supporting Trump all through the through primaries, and I believe that you were a California delegate as well. For the GOP, and some of the, let's just say, the perspective has also always been on kind of like, how could you be voting for this man?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, what many Americans fail to realize is that President Trump received more votes than President nominee Romney or McCain, and actually received more Hispanic American votes than many news outlets projected. Now, myself included, my whole family, by the way, voted for Trump. We're legal immigrants, but you're right in that there's an inherent cognitive dissonance, if you will, with the mainstream media, that if you're a Hispanic, African American, a minority of any kind, how could you vote for Trump? But I think that question itself is inherently racist. Now, they'd like to throw the racist card around a lot, but they somehow feel as if a certain racial demographic cannot vote a certain way. They, for some reason, are not free to have their own political views. Now, I think that what has hurt more Americans is many of these far-left liberal policies that have kept Hispanic Americans, African Americans impoverished. So we can talk more about that in depth, but I think that it's been a real genuine privilege to be on President Trump's National Diversity Coalition, to try to communicate that message to our communities, to make sure all communities are represented in President Trump's policies.
So the inherent racism that you see, which is identity politics at large, right? And we see that from the left, we see that from the Democratic Party, we see that from the progressives, and we see it in almost every election.
Yeah.
It's nothing new. As long as I've been aware of politics, it's always been used, and it's pitting groups against other groups. There's a lot of fear right now in the Mexican American community, especially when it comes to immigrants and illegal immigrants, which is a word they don't like to use.
Right.
Okay. The fact is that they are trying, from what I understand, the Trump administration is focusing on those that are of concern of a criminal element.
Right.
Gang members and such like this.
This is, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but this is a very, very important topic for me and my family. So when I was about 4 years old, my family actually had a hit put out from MS-13. My brother was targeted by MS-13 for reporting a crime that involved MS-13 jumping my father and stabbing my uncle, just innocent bystanders. And that kind of neighborhood in inner city Los Angeles, I think that what President Trump has identified in Chicago, in Los Angeles, we find that he genuinely cares about the inner cities, and there needs to be we need to uphold law and order. And I think that's a major initiative for President Trump. Just yesterday, we announced with the National Diversity Coalition for Trump that we have a Chicago initiative where Pastor Darrell Scott is going to look to help the African American community in Chicago. But personally speaking, President Trump's let's talk about his immigration policy as it relates to South American refugees or migrants, Mexican migrants. We're not looking to tear families apart. We're looking to make sure we weed out those that do not have the best interests of the United States in mind. So that includes criminal illegal immigrants. That includes gang members from MS-13. That includes drug dealers. I mean, the drugs that are pouring across the border, it's reaching as far as New Hampshire. Those drugs aren't coming from from across the Atlantic. In many cases they're coming from south of the border. So it's, yes, a national security issue. It's a culture issue for the United States, but it's also an economic issue. We have to make sure we're protecting Americans first. In a perfect world, perhaps we might want to have a borderless world where our entire universe, had a I like to call it a pro-freedom ideology.
Right.
That's not the case.
Right.
We have to protect American ideology. We have to make sure that American ideology is in place.
So you have this, and on paper it sounds correct and logical and it makes sense. But when you have a message that is being perpetuated by a majority of the mainstream media that is fear-mongering and scaring people that really don't have the wherewithal to learn the real information, how do you get that message to those individuals that are most affected and most fearful?
Sure. So this is particularly why the National Diversity Coalition exists, because unfortunately, I believe the mass media has been hijacked by a leftist narrative, a very liberal narrative that Republican politics, that conservative politics are all about pro-white agendas. That's not the case. They've tried to brand Steve Bannon as a racist. When both of us know that's not the case. Many of our, those who know Steve Bannon know that that's not the case. They try to brand President Trump as a racist, which we know that is not far away from the case. That's not the case at all. His wife is an immigrant. The National Diversity Coalition exists to educate our communities. We have leaders from all across the spectrum, not just African American, Hispanic American, Asian American communities, but also Native American communities and everywhere in between. And so I feel as though what our initiative is going to be, what it will look like in the next few years, is one that not only seeks to educate our communities, but ensure that we expand the base of Hispanic Americans, African Americans, and minority Americans, which, by the way, I fall into this as well. We've unfortunately bought into identity politics as Republicans, as conservatives, because the left has painted that. They've used those tactics against us.
How has the left fallen into identity? The right. How's the right fallen into identity politics?
Well, President Trump is getting away from it. And this is why I appreciated what he did this cycle. So the Romney campaigns, the McCain campaign, even the George W. Bush campaign had coalitions that were that aimed to reach out to minority communities, right? Well, we ought not to be reaching out to minority communities. We frankly should be expanding the tent and opening the base. I think of it logically as the concept is that we're all Americans first. We don't need to divide each other by Hispanic American label or African American labels. We're all Americans first. So what President Trump actually, this was remarkable. He didn't have a formal coalition base. He didn't have African American outreach. He didn't have Hispanic American outreach. Our coalition existed independently, and President Trump recognized that with Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen was his SVP for his chief legal officer, and Michael Cohen with Omarosa and Pastor Darrell Scott, as well as Bruce Lavelle and a few others. Including Martin Luther King's niece, all served in this coalition. And so the right has unfortunately, Republicans, conservatives, we've fallen into and we've bought into this concept that we have to reach out more rather than including and eliminating completely these race-based identity politics.
I think it's much harder done than said.
It's much harder done than said.
Are we past a tipping point where cultural identity politics, sexual identity politics, ethnicity identity politics, it is such a part of our culture that we have youngsters, and outside of this hall here where you've got some incredible youth.
Yeah.
But the meme basically is that their response to anything they disagree with or they don't like is that you're a racist.
It's that you're racist. And this is the problem, is anytime you bring that word out, you're forgetting about, it's a lazy response. There's no actual policy being discussed. And that's what Americans need to do, not just Republicans. All Americans need to start sticking to issues.
Yeah.
The United States will be a much better country if we can actually stick to the issues, rather than labeling somebody homophobic or racist or a bigot or whatever it might be.
Right, right.
Dig into the details. Dig into why that might be.
Right. Another issue I'd love to discuss with you is based upon the fact that you are with the Global Entrepreneurship Program through the U.S. State Department.
Right.
And from a geopolitical standpoint, obviously as a supporter for Donald Trump and the Republican Party, national security and trade and everything else that we're looking outside of the United States, what I heard from Donald Trump and his speech, and it wasn't just yesterday's speech, but it's a continuing theme, is that nationalism is now the top of the priority. That we are, in effect, looking inward, and we're not here to help the world, we're here to make sure America is rebuilt.
Right.
How does that impact trade relationships and moving forward with business and such around the world?
Great question. So we heard yesterday President Trump's remarks where he said that I'm not here to be the president of the world. I'm here to be your president.
Right.
And this is a stark contrast from the last administration. So how that affects trade is, let's take a step back and think now. You know, I've spoken to a few friends of mine that work in the State Department, and they are, many of them are Democrats who have, their world has been rocked. Let's put it that way.
This entire city's been rocked.
Their world has been rocked.
Yes. It's an earthquake.
They feel as though President Trump does not have the tact. They feel as though he doesn't have the professionalism or the diplomacy that previous presidents had. And on the surface, that may not.
Do they feel that about Tillerson?
Well, they think that what they believe is that there is a disruption of the current order in the State Department, and that is because you have a businessman who's come in, who is as many turnaround consultants will do. They're going to have to they have to shed sunlight on these problems, and they're going to have to start reorganizing. And many people who've worked in the State Department know that the bureaucracy is such that you can't get anything done, much of the federal government. Now, President Trump is a businessman first. Yes, maybe he did have a small loan from his father, but he turned that into a $10 billion empire. You don't do that by being a bad negotiator or a poor businessman.
Right.
How that relates to his presidency is that he's taking a look at these trade policies and he's saying, look, we have a $500 billion trade deficit with China. The United States is being ripped off by Mexico, by China, by Japan, and any great negotiator knows that you need to anchor high and you need to push the limit so that as you negotiate a new trade deal, they respect and you'll find middle ground. So in any good negotiation, you need to push the limit. That's what President Trump has done. He shook China up when he took the phone call from the Taiwanese president.
Yep.
That was very much, I think, a signal that anything is fair game. So how it relates to trade policy and what President Trump administration is going to do is renegotiate trade policies so that the United States is not suffering these massive trade deficits. He is looking, as you may have seen, to reduce regulation to make sure. The United States doesn't have an import tax for many of these countries. You have to remember that is adding significantly to not just our deficit, but it hurts American products that are made here. And so I think that between renegotiating trade policies so that there's a more streamlined and American advantage in these trade policies, but also ensuring that we have regulations that are cut, red tape that is cut so that we can start producing more American goods, so that American manufacturing firms can be more prosperous. And this is why these Fortune 500 CEOs who met with President Trump this week were so thrilled, to the point where they said this is the most pro-business American president in the history of the United States.
There's a lot of concern regarding this border tax. It's almost being compared to a value-added tax of some type. And there's a lot of there's a lot of concern within the Republican Congress themselves. There's people that are for it, and there's people that are dead set against it.
Right.
Some people believe, and this has been written about by Steve Forbes and others, that it's going to actually add to the cost of goods and services that Americans are going to pay.
Sure.
It isn't going to impact Mexico. It isn't going to impact Latin America. It's going to impact American. how does that argument get circled with what President Trump's trying to do?
Sure. So I'm a very huge proponent not of just free trade but fair trade.
Okay.
It hurts American companies when they have to compete with goods and services that are produced overseas, by countries who do not adhere to human rights laws or the labor practices that we have that protect our workers here in the United States. So we're not operating on the same plane.
Right.
If the United States had child labor, if the United States had slave labor, these sweatshops that are rampant in China, that are rampant in Mexico, that are rampant overseas, sure, yeah, we wouldn't need a value-added tax. We wouldn't need a border tax. But unfortunately, I should say fortunately, we do protect our workers. We make sure that students, that children and Americans do not have to work in working conditions that are as reprehensible as we've seen in some of these sweatshops overseas. And so those countries fail to operate on the same playing field that we do. I think that the ideal policy would be that those countries employ practices that are similar to those of the United States, where they have human rights, where they are actually adhering to human rights practices, where labor practices are on a different level, if you will. Mm-hmm. But in the short run, will it hurt Americans? Yeah, we're going to be a little upset. We're going to pay $3 for a dozen eggs, or we'll have to. I should say, you're talking about.
We're talking about tariffs, and we're talking
about tariffs.
Right.
You're talking about goods that are produced overseas. Yeah, we may have to pay a little bit more for an iPhone. Maybe that will force Apple to actually manufacture an iPhone in the United States. Maybe after they see that with the taxes that are going to be imposed at the border, they say, you know what, it's marginal, but maybe we'll make the iPhone in the United States.
Do you believe it is marginal? Do you believe that it's not going to impact working families and the like? I mean, from a perspective of open markets and freedom, right? A lot of libertarians will look at that and say that it's going to cause inflation, it's going to cause prices to increase, and it's going to hurt the people that it could be at least afford.
Sure. No, I totally understand that concept. Unfortunately, we live in a world where if there's a way that the United States can impact other nations' labor practices, that is the ideal. That is the 100% ideal. But with American firms shutting down because they can't compete with companies that are, by the way, influenced and funded by their own federal governments. The state, there are many state-sponsored manufacturing plants overseas that benefit from their governments pumping money into them as well. So the United States, we have to do something to make sure that our companies can participate and can actually compete on an international level. Now, of course, I'm not a proponent of increased trade, increased tariffs in any case, but we have to look after the United States companies first. We have to look at American workers first. It's all good and well that we can actually purchase a product that may be a little bit cheaper if you have a job, if you're actually employed. But if we can't make things in the United States, if we don't have companies
it circles back to the fact that there's going to be more manufacturing in the United States. That means that there's going to be more employment, more people with good jobs able to afford higher prices if they do in fact occur.
Yes, precisely.
Okay. Last point for you. From your perspective, foreign policy. We're obviously, as a part of the State Department, you've shared with us that there is a concern right now inside, and I think that's a transitional thing.
Right.
There's, like you said, the city's been rocked.
They are rocked.
Okay.
The worlds have been rocked.
And there's people here that all of a sudden have woken up and realized that, administration is only 4 or 8 years. They're not going to have a job indefinitely anyway.
Right.
But with that being said, let's talk geopolitically. Let's talk about what's happening right now with Russia and even the Middle East. From your perspective, Donald Trump obviously taking a look at America first, but is taking a rather focused and hard line in the Middle East, supporting Israel, even referring to a possible one-state solution, which no president has ever referred to.
Right.
Okay. From your perspective, what does foreign policy look like for the next 4-8 years?
So I think the first thing is we have to applaud President Trump for appointing somebody as dynamic as Rex Tillerson. Secretary Tillerson is a world-class diplomat, a world-class leader, who doesn't bring a lifelong of diplomacy with him in the formal sense, in the traditional sense, if you will. But as the chairman of Exxon, he has a businessman's perspective in how to tackle issues that affect a large bureaucracy. So, number one, I believe that yes, the State Department has cut down on its hiring. There's a hiring freeze, as you know, for the next 90 days. But also, they're going to be streamlining, from what I've heard on the inside, they've been streamlining a lot of different departments' initiatives. So, how that relates to our foreign policy is that President Trump is going to be taking a very practical approach. So, let's take Israel, for example.
Okay.
Why is it so imperative that we support Israel as a perhaps one-state solution? And his comments, by the way, were that either a one-state or a two-state solution, whichever both sides best prefer. Those were his exact words. But the United States is a friend of Israel because Israel is the sole democracy in the Middle East.
Right.
And it's not a dictatorship.
Right.
They share American interests. So I think President Trump is taking an American first approach. In not the sense that it's a nationalistic approach, but a values-based approach, in that we believe in freedoms, we believe in liberties, we believe in the protection of religion, freedom of practice. Many of the values which surrounding states around Israel and the Middle East do not adhere to. So it's a values-based approach to foreign policy, not just with our allies, but also, many folks may believe that it's not. It is not a good idea that the United States cozies up with Russia. Well, let's take a step back and ask ourselves, why is it that Secretary Clinton and the Obama administration tried to reset with Russia? Because there's more value to be had in gaining an ally with Russia than to have an enemy in Russia. So will President Trump deal with the Crimea situation? I believe he will. I think that there's been enough international pressure.
Is there going to be some give and take with Crimea or and Syria combined, and saying if you support us in Syria and help us, we'll maybe kind of just turn our head a little bit?
It's a catch-22. So there's been some internal dialogue, and I'm not privy to this. This is pure speculation. But there has been dialogue, and it goes to what the people of Crimea most want. The Crimeans, and I was in Ukraine in 2014 while the Russian invasion occurred in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, in eastern Ukraine. The people of Crimea, they simply want to belong to a country that's stable. They didn't necessarily believe that was the case with Ukraine. Many of the Crimeans, they still adhere to the Soviet. I would say that they're Soviet identities.
Right.
And so, if the people of Crimea feel comfortable with I hate to use the word annexation with Russia, but it goes to how does that affect the United States? Now, many may believe that is a form of appeasement that the United States is taking in that practice. But what I find important is that we look at the big picture. This was the reason that Russia invaded Crimea was because of the eastward expansion of NATO, and again, President Putin believes that there is a sovereignty to Russia, and there was an agreement that Russia would be able to hold its existing sphere of influence, if you will, in the former Soviet blocs, and that NATO would not continue to expand eastward. Now, I believe that NATO does serve a good purpose for global stability. Now, I think that President Trump will come to the point where, if he relies on his advisors, he'll find a solution to that, very difficult situation with Russia and Ukraine. But I think that hiring Rex Tillerson was a very smart move because of his ties with not just Moscow, but all the global states that surround it.
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, we're at the beginning stages of this, and just in over a month, we've seen more more movement, and I think this is what's incredible to me. The left, their heads are exploding because there's so many stories every single day, and it's almost trying to, play pin the tail on the donkey in the dark with these guys. Right. And so, whether it's three-dimensional chess or he's just basically coming in and as a businessman, he says, "This is all the things we want to do, and we're going to get them going." At this pace, I got to tell you, there's going to be some significant change in the next 4 to 8 years, and it's going to be hopefully.
It'll be 8 years.
And based upon what I saw yesterday, and it isn't just the energy in the room for Donald Trump, because obviously these are his supporters. What I saw with Donald Trump himself, as a person, it almost looks as if this is a natural role for him. For an unnatural behavior in that role, if that makes sense.
Right.
He's completely turned everything on its head. And I think a lot of people around the country, obviously we saw with the election, appreciate that. They knew that something needed to change. You needed a bull in the china shop, this being the china shop behind us. And he's coming through ramming roughshod. And it's going to be a very, very interesting 4 to probably 8 years at this rate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, greatly appreciate. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter. It's at Chris Garcia USA.
At Chris Garcia USA. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks,
Thank
Dave.
you so much.
Thank you.